Welcome to Between Two Clinicians, the podcast that gives you a backstage pass into the mind of two therapists. I'm Talia.
I'm Adam Luke. We've spent years helping others navigate the complexities of their minds and relationships.
In this podcast, we're flipping the script, and we're sharing our own unfiltered insights. No topic is off limits, and no issue too taboo. We're ready to tackle the tough stuff with honesty and empathy. Let's dive in. I love it when I'm on other podcasts and I hear babies in the background or dogs.
Yes.
That's my favorite.
Absolutely. They're part of our lives.
They have to be. They make their debut.
That's so funny. So you may hear my 11-month-old in the background, but welcome to another episode of Between Two Clinicians.
And we came up with a brutal title right before we recorded. I'm just in a mood today. The episode today will be discussing self-sabotage and that you are the reason that you can't have nice things. And we'll dive into it. We'll just dive right in.
I can't wait to see the analytics of like everyone signed off at 35 seconds. Like as soon as like
that's rude. Oh, no, I don't need to hear that.
No, don't need this negativity. Well,
so where do you want to start? I have some ideas.
Yeah, I mean, let's set the table here. Why are we having this conversation? I think there's like some themes coming up in the work that I'm doing with clients of individuals who have for a very long time said, hey, I want these things out of life. I want to have a super connected spouse or significant other. I want to have certain joys in other relationships, whatever it might be. Yeah. Then we get on the cusp of getting the thing that we have told everyone and our therapist for years that we want. And then all of a sudden we reject the idea. We're either upset at the timing. Well, it didn't happen on my time. It happened on the universe's time. It happened on their time. Or why does this person that I had so much resentment for, all of a sudden they get to become a good person again? Why do they get to do that?
I would say part of where this comes from, and this is what we were talking about a little bit before we started recording, and at least in like psychoanalytic terms, it stems from early infancy and early childhood where in part our parents were just for us. Oh, yeah. And we have to work through like the Oedipal complex. Hopefully it resolves successfully anyway, meaning like it goes away, not like when we actually win out our parent instead of our other parent being partnered with them, that we have this desire to be the sole object of our primary caregivers, and that we get used to that. Siblings is a whole other discussion, but we get used to that because it's like we have two people, really it's just one, we just see the mother at first. Like there's two people who love us unconditionally, hopefully, again, this is an ideal, and we are their special angel for the most part, right? Yeah. Or we interpret it that way. And children are incredibly narcissistic, not as a diagnosis, but like that's the point. Like they're little kids, they think they have all the power, and oftentimes parents lend their narcissism, that trait to the kid, and then they eventually give it back. Sometimes it doesn't shake out that way, but kids grow up thinking their parents can do no wrong, that they are the only source of love, and then we become confused when it's like, but why do I have to share dad with you? Or why do I have to share mom with you? It's just for me. So it starts from that template and eventually graduates into, as we get older, like, well, if I got everything I wanted growing up, why can't, like petulant child, like why can't I get that now as an adult? And if I didn't get everything I wanted growing up, I am going to project that and expect that of my adult romantic partner as a way to level the playing field that never got leveled from my childhood. True. Because our adult romantic relationships are the closest, not sexually, but closeness, intimacy wise, to our primary relationship with our parents. Correct. So it pushes on all of those wounds or on all of those healed parts to be like, hey, you like this, go get more of it. Or you never got this, go get more of it, or go get it at all. And I think in part, at least from my frame, that's where I look at it, that self-sabotage comes in, because deep down, that subconscious template that gets finalized around 7 or 8, everything you learn up until that point is like your template for the world. If you don't have the belief that you actually are capable or deserving of getting everything that you want, when it starts to come up in your life, you will sabotage it because it's too much for your psyche to hold all the parts at the same time. It's like, well, we've never had this before. I don't want to feel like a novice. So in order to avoid feeling like a novice, and in order to avoid not feeling good enough for all of this, I'm just going to sabotage it in some way, or like we chatted
Yeah.
about too, engage in like a counter dependency, which almost looks like avoidant attachment, where I will not rely on you. I actually
Mhm.
don't want you to save me because I've got it all myself. Because deep down, what if I get everything I want? It's not, and you leave. That's one fear.
Mhm.
What if I get everything I want and you stay? Like, who do I have to become now if I do get everything I
Talk about
want?
the
And I,
work.
yeah, right. And
Wait a
that's,
second,
we're so we're just gonna go right in.
if my highly avoidant significant other all of a sudden becomes extremely present, I have to
Mm-hmm.
recognize that there's been secondary gains I've enjoyed about their
Uh-huh.
absence, right?
Yep.
Like they're easier to manage. I see this a lot when I'm working with like whether it's my clients with sex addiction or with substance abuse, where there
Mm-hmm.
is a level where
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
spouse who is not the spouse that is using substances or engaged in sexual addiction becomes frustrated that this person is now more present. Now it's everything that they've complained about. Why do you go to the bar? Why are you never home? Why do you do these work trips? Why do you... But then all
Yeah.
of a sudden the individual actually pivots. There is obviously a very painful disclosure that happens in this process, but when
Mm-hmm.
we move into the fact that okay, now we can actually sit here and say we have evidence of this person trying to have a deeper, more well-connected relationship, that also then now makes that non-offending spouse
Mm-hmm.
feel leveraged. Well,
Yeah.
wait a second, I'm now losing my whole narrative cycle. I used to be able to blame everything, my own personal
Mm-hmm.
emotions. Oh, my depression, my anxiety, my lack of happiness, whatever those things might be, I could blame those on the other person. They became the scapegoat. And now
Yeah.
I'm losing my scapegoat. My scapegoat's showing up now as a knight in shining armor, and that doesn't fit my narrative.
The longer that you keep somebody in your mind as like the bad object, or
Hmm.
if they would only change, then I could be this, then that it's like a snowball effect that amplifies. And then the version of you that created or painted your partner out to
Hmm.
be that monster to keep you safe, when you try to lean in and keep pull the veil back and you're like, oh, it's not a monster after all, it's like a my partner in sheep's clothing kind of a
Yep.
thing. Like, you look at them and you're like, oh, and but the part it's the part of you that
Mm,
designed them as a monster to keep yourself safe that gets activated. And that's the part of you, in my theory, that self-sabotages, because it's like, nah, bitch, you're not leaving us. I've been here for you while he was treating you right. It's that internal dialogue. I've been here for you while he was treating you like that. I kept you safe. I kept you this. I kept you distant from the person that you thought was a
mhm.
monster. And now all of a sudden he does whatever, one nice thing. It's usually more than that.
Yeah.
But like, he's starting to make these changes and I don't like it one bit, because that means I'm going to be abandoned. And usually that
Mhm,
part of you is little you, depending on the age, but
mhm.
usually that part of you is little you saying, but what happens if we get hurt again? Right? It's like that
Yeah,
above ground anger is really covering up that deep down
absolutely.
vulnerability and fear of vulnerability and true fear of dependence. Because what
Yeah,
happened the last time you were dependent? Let's go back to infancy and childhood. Were your
for
needs
sure.
met or not? To what degree? Right? It all, to me,
Mm,
it all comes together, because how you first had your relationship with dependency
yeah.
and having your needs met will play out in your adult romantic relationships. What if the avoidant becomes
Mm,
available is not a comfortable thought for most people, because then it's like, oh, then I have to stop listening to all these self-help podcasts, reading all these books,
mm,
demonizing them, validating myself by laughing about all these reels and sending them to my friends of like, oh my God, this is so whoever you're dating. That's
yep.
a type that you have. You're choosing to date an emotionally unavailable or avoidant person, or somebody who's counter dependent.
Wait. What do you mean
Wait, you mean
choosing? I gotta
I
put
have
myself
accountability?
here? Yeah, no, see, this is like
Couldn't be me.
well, this is that side of the road. You have a side of the road in all of these
Mm-hmm.
experiences. Just to piggyback on what you're saying, it's also bringing in, like in business psychology, we use a lot about sunk cost fallacy, which is the thought process of I have spent so much time and effort in something that I continue to
Mm-hmm.
throw good time, effort, financial resources after bad things. Like
Yeah,
there are moments in projects that you recognize there's no way for us to bring this to market. It's just not
correct.
going to play out. Now I can continue to throw all the R&D, all the money after it as
Mm-hmm.
possible. I still won't get what I want. This is where your emotions come in and say, well, no, we've hated this person for 15 years or for 5 years or for whatever that arbitrary number is. We can't stand him. If we pivot
Mm-hmm.
now, what do we, like, how do we reconcile all that lost time, effort, energy
Yeah.
in building this narrative? And so
Yeah.
there are people that are very much living lives based off of narratives that no longer apply to them, but they're trying to keep the series alive. They're trying to make the
Yes.
sequels happen.
They're committed to the role.
Oh, they are.
They're
They're
it's
100%.
method acting at its finest. Yeah.
Dude, like, that's a great
Yeah.
insight right there, is there are people that are method acting lives they don't want to live,
Mm-hmm.
you
They're
know?
committed. They're married to the game.
They're married
There's
to the game. It's funny they bring that up. Do you mind if I just
yeah. Yeah, go for it.
because like, so I I do, and I know this is something that you do, is working as a dating coach at times
Mm-hmm.
and whatnot, but I'll never forget, as a therapist, I was working with a client that, again, amazing woman, super successful, but she was outlining like what she wanted in a committed relationship. She couldn't find this relationship. She was so pissed off. No good man exists, right? And I'm
Mm-hmm.
very much a gee golly whiz therapist. Like, well, let's try this. Let's see what we can do. So she chucks a rock and hits Prince Charming, right? Like, we
Mm.
actually find this person, right?
Yep. Yep.
And like, solid vetting, he exists, right? But then there was this part where she recognized, and to get into a relationship, I no longer become the main character in a relationship, right? I have to share the microphone. All of a sudden, this story is being written with two authors, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was an interesting situation to watch her walk away from this relationship, not because there was really any harm involved, but she actually didn't want what she wanted. And that was an interesting thing to feel as a therapist, because there was also
Yeah.
times she projected that back at me of like, see what you're saying, nothing works here. But at the same time, we have to accept, like, well, no, you said this is what you wanted, but you cherished the independence that you supposedly hated, and you prioritized it over actually feeling accepted, connected, seen, and heard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if I've never felt that, or it was it was also painful in the relational transactions that I had with the person I felt that with, maybe is a
Mm,
wordier, but also
yeah,
ironically more eloquent way to say,
you
if
nailed
I don't
it.
know what to do with what you're giving me, one of my favorite papers, I've quoted it in probably every podcast interview I've ever done, but it's called "You're Giving Me What I Need, but I Have No Place to Put It." So if I don't have
Mm,
a part of my psychic bookshelf cleared out, if you will, let's say this like top corner
yeah,
was empty, if I don't if this is full and
yeah,
you hand me another stack of books, obviously you can see they're all like perfectly aligned. I don't have a place to put that. It
yeah.
won't fit. It's going to be topsy turvy. It's going to be lopsided. It's going to make me uncomfortable, and then it's going to feel cluttered. And I'll be like, I just get rid of it.
You said the
Like
perfect
you
word,
just,
perfect.
yeah.
It won't be perfect. It won't look
Mm-hmm.
like everything else. It won't be like
It'll be
everything else.
human, and it will expose that I have flaws, which I've
Mhm.
worked for my whole life to try to not have it all.
Oh,
I am
absolutely.
infallible. I will not make mistakes. So it's almost like I'm sure this has dawned on me before, but I'm working through this in live time, that in an effort to avoid being seen as weak, we
Mhm.
try to emulate and adopt the character traits that we believed of our parents when we were infants and children, meaning that they are infallible, they make no mistakes, they are superheroes. So it's like the student becomes the master in a
Mm,
way. It's like, well, if I can't find a partner who is that, just kidding, yes, I can, and it's too uncomfortable, it's untenable, then I will just become that
yeah.
person. And you think you want what you want until you get it, and you realize how much it actually costs you in every sense of the resource words: time, energy, money, psychic ability, that you actually have to change when you get what you want to at least maintain it. And most people aren't ready to have that. Yeah, it doesn't take just overnight.
Well, but just to piggyback on what you're saying, the change doesn't have to be bad. It just requires
No,
change. Like, that's
but
that's what was interesting, is we
yes,
accept the idea of, like, if I'm doing these things differently, then all of a sudden they have to be hostile or they're malicious, or I'm losing myself in this process. Well,
hmm,
I will agree that when you go from single life to a relational life, there is an aspect of your life that you lose. Why do I
yes,
trade that away? Because I like my life in fellowship, in
yes,
relationship, in the,
yes,
so yeah, you can't have your cake and eat it, but you
right,
are able to say, but I enjoy this side more. And
hmm,
it's just like, I mean, freaking Rockefeller said it the best. How much money do you need? $1 more. So that we do this with love. We do this with our relationships. where we can be so wealthy in the relationships that are around us, but we want that one more
Mhm.
thing. And that's normally the thing that then makes the whole facade fall apart. We
Mhm.
see
And
this,
that's where, yeah.
you see this a lot, like when engagements happen, where there's
Mhm.
just love, everything's perfect, they get engaged, and then all of a sudden there's the like, well, you're pretty perfect, but you won't do that one thing for me. I see it a lot through guys of like, oh, she wants me to sell the motorcycle. I got to sell the bass boat. I
Mhm.
got to sell these. Like, and there is this part where we sit down when we do premarital counseling where it's like, okay, let's walk through this. Weren't these the same things that drew you towards him? Like,
Mhm.
you liked riding on the motorcycle. You liked doing these things. Yeah, but now I don't want to be the bad guy in this situation, but I'm more than willing to write the role for him to play.
Mhm. And the more, so it's, I have so much to say. The more that we are attracted to that edginess or that
Mhm.
bad boy, what's the like edgy girl, not
Yeah.
like bad girl, but like the rough around the edges, they have a story that the more we got attracted to them in the first place, it's like taming Beast from Beauty and the Beast. And then you finally get them to, at the end, he turns into a person, but
Yeah.
it's like you finally get them to be a person and that you've tamed them. And then you're like, and now the change commences. And it was fun when
Mm,
we were just dating. But now that I'm looking at you as a serious partner to be a provider or a protector in my life, this stuff has got to go. The stuff that puts your life at risk has got to
mm,
go. The stuff that puts our future life at risk has got to go. Because to your point, I'm now making myself important. Obviously, ideally, if you're engaged, both
mm,
partners make each other important and themselves important. But sometimes it's this lopsided, we've done that mutuality
yeah.
trumps equality, that like it's not being done mutually. It's often that one partner is dictating to the other partner. You would, and this usually goes from women to men.
Mhm.
And the opposite for men is like, oh no, they see all of that from the beginning. They just choose to be like, I accept you for who you are. And
Yeah.
you talk about this with guy friends that they're like, oh, isn't she a little intense? Isn't she a little that? And they're like, yeah, I know. As long as they know it and they've taken ownership,
Mhm.
they will make it work. They're never going to leave. For the guys that are
Mm,
like, I see her for all she is and I accept it, whether I like it or not is
yeah.
an aside. I'm in it, is a totally different mindset than when most women have. And
Mm,
Lori Gottlieb wrote the book Mr. Good Enough: The
yeah,
Case for
yeah.
Settling, whatever. I forget the exact title. I don't want to butcher it more than I already have. But she, in the beginning of the book, it's like level 1, husband. She just lists all these traits. But if you want the next model, go to level 2, and then you read through all of it, and it's like level 7. This floor doesn't exist. This proves to show that you are
Yeah.
unrealistic in your needs of relationship. Like no one person, just like in childhood, we had to get over that necessary loss.
Yeah.
No one person is going to be everything for you. And often when maximizers partner with maximizers are, I could always do better,
Yeah.
whether that's my job, my looks, my partner, partners with a satisficer, meaning like this will do and I'll make it work. One person constantly feels like they'll never be accepted for who they are, or rarely will be accepted for who they
Mm,
are, and they're not good enough.
yep.
And that's secretly sometimes how the maximizer feels deep down about themselves, but they introject it into the
Mm,
partner who's like, I'm good enough as I am. And this partner's like, well, how do I get that? And instead of asking, like, hey, how did you feel good enough about who you are? They're
yeah.
like a dementor. They're like, I'm just going to take it from you. Like
Exactly.
the fact that you feel good enough makes me insecure about my not feeling good enough. So both of us are not going to feel good enough at the end of this.
And that's where you, as a therapist, sort of sit from the box seats, like
Yes.
sipping the tea. Like,
Eating the popcorn.
how does this feel? You said that you wanted this. Like,
Hmm.
there's these sides of, man, maybe we're not actually communicating what we want. And that is probably
You'll never get everything you want.
exactly.
And the Cinderella complex, we talked about that off air, that like somebody's coming to rescue you or save you. Far more common, I would think, when the
Mm,
book was written in 1981. Obviously, times
yeah.
and change has and culture has changed since then. Like decades ago, women couldn't even have a bank account or their own credit. Like
Mm,
things have changed that we're not actually dependent, but that unconscious fear of being dependent, or in some ways fear of being like independent forever and ending up as like the crazy cat lady trope,
mm,
motivates a lot of people to sometimes settle, meaning the actual
yeah.
word settling, like, oh, I could have done better but I just didn't want to, way
Mhm,
too early, because the societal stigma of being partnered, who you're partnered to, if culture
mm,
plays a role in this, like is there something about being married young. For some religious
Sure.
or other faith-based cultures, it's like, well, if you're not married young, you're an old maid. And then for other
Mm,
cultures, it's like living with your parents multi-generationally is normal till your
yeah.
30s. Like, we obviously have to take culture into account with this, but so many people don't actually know what they
Mm,
want. And for those that do, I'm here to tell you, it's part of a necessary loss. You're not going to get everything you want out of life, especially when it comes to your romantic relationship,
yep.
because it's not under your control. It is another
Mm,
person, their own sentient being with their own wants and needs. As long as you're not ending up with what you don't want, that's the partner for you. You will not get everything you want, but you at a minimum cannot end up with what you don't want. And that's the
mm,
dichotomy of settling, where people are like, well, they have all these great traits on my list, but they also hit me, treat me like shit and whatever, but I get all these things I wanted, so I'll just make do with this. It's like, you have to look at it opposite. They cannot do anything that you can't tolerate. Like, you interact with and still have
yep.
respect for. If you lose self-respect or respect for your partner, there's not going to be a future likely in that relationship, because slowly but surely it's going to chip away at you. Like you're saying, that sunk cost fallacy.
Mhm.
Sometimes you just got to know when to call it. And there was one thing I wanted to add before I switch the mic over, because I'm going to forget it if I don't. This is from, I talked about this with a client,
Mm,
a coaching client a few years ago. And I had talked to her about the sunk cost fallacy. And I said, it sounds like you're trying to prove him wrong, that like you're not the monster. And it's a good thing that you stayed.
mm,
Therefore, you have value and you can experience that, can experience the relationship you finally wanted. It would feed into your
yeah.
own savior complex and enforce that there's something with you that's positive or
Mm,
worthwhile because you help somebody, and that you don't have to suffer for nothing. So a lot of people are like, well,
mm,
I suffered and I'm not going to suffer for nothing. Like, they want their pain to mean something.
yep.
And it's
Even
not
if their
always the
pain,
case.
like,
Yeah.
your pain is not your purpose. So just because 'cause
No.
you've experienced pain doesn't mean we want to replicate that with someone else just so that they can know what we felt once. But
Right.
from a psychodynamic point, a lot of times that we're like, "No, I want you to feel the burn."
Yeah,
And
you need to feel the pain of either what I felt or of what you've made me feel
mhm.
by me coming in and expecting you to save me, you never agreeing to saving me, and now I'm going to punish you for not saving me. And now, time for an ad break. Hey there, listeners. We're interrupting your favorite podcast to bring you a special message from our friends over at Therapy Swag. Are you tired of the same old boring wardrobe? Ready to add a dash of sass and style into your closet while repping mental health? Look no further than Therapy Swag, your go-to online store for snarky shirts and mugs. Their products make awesome gifts for friends, family, or anyone in need of a little pick-me-up. They are on a mission to break the stigma surrounding mental health. They use humor and creativity to open up dialogue, challenge stereotypes, and remind us it's okay to not be okay. Because let's face it, laughter is the best medicine. So why settle for ordinary when you can stand out with Therapy Swag? Head over to their website today and treat yourself to some snarky goodness. Trust us, your wardrobe and your mood will thank you. Thanks to our sponsor for supporting the show. Now back to your regularly scheduled programming.
I mean, another way to take into consideration self-sabotage is literally using yourself as collateral damage.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's time to move yourself out of the process of why
Mm-hmm.
do you have to hurt yourself to then be okay with yourself?
Where did you learn that lesson? That's
Mhm.
always the question that I ask when self-sabotage is at play.
You know, and I think that comes to a position of helplessness and hopelessness. I don't feel like I have any influence, any power in my life. So if I blow this situation up, I can at
Mm-hmm.
least say I was the one that ended it. It's
It's a
like,
false sense of control.
oh yeah, it is. Well,
Yeah.
because all of our anxiety is really always pushing for control. The ultimate way of having control is blowing something up.
Yep.
You know, that's why I call them emotional IEDs. Like, you will sit
Mm-hmm.
into a situation where you will get to a position where you're so overwhelmed, so frustrated, so pissed off that
Yeah.
pain is better than the discomfort of being unsatisfied.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that we need to, like, listen to that one out loud, right? Like, pain is better than the discomfort of being unsatisfied. No, it's not. But it is a cheap narrative we're willing to buy into, because it's
Mm-hmm.
also kind of like an instant gratification. I can make pain happen really quick in my life. What takes longer is healing. What takes
Yeah.
longer is self-discovery, self-awareness. Those things are a challenge for me, but I could feel something. I'd rather feel something than the sadness of recognizing that some things are out of my control. This podcast episode is not about bringing like depression into your house.
No,
Like
no.
this is more about the realization of like, okay, you're the problem, you're also the solution. And this needs to be said more often because that goes back to the Cinderella complex. Sometimes people are waiting and waiting and waiting for someone to
Yeah.
come and save them. Normally, when I'm working with my clients, I talk about paint the silhouette of the person who's going to step through that door, who's going to step through that threshold. And a lot of times, people will
Yeah.
paint a silhouette of who they could be for their own selves. Like,
Yes.
you have to realize
Yep.
that you are going to have to fill the emergency raft. You're the one that's going to pull the handle. So no one
Yeah.
else is paying attention. No one else knows what pain you're going through. You can do this. You can do your own triage. I'm not asking you to do life alone.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just saying for
Mm-mm.
right now, you're going to put the tourniquet on and stop the bleeding. And then we'll be
Mm-hmm.
able to cultivate that concert of support around us where we can actually start leaning on other people. There was an instance in my own life. I'll never forget when I was doing my EMDR training. And I was sitting there, Laura Steele, she's a dean at Hope International University psych program. She's an amazing woman. And I'll never forget, like a total idiot, I go up to the front. It was our first, really, we're going to start training. And so we had to pick a target, right? And like a total ass, I walk up to her and I'm like, I just don't really think I have a target at all. And she like starts cracking up, right? Because I'm not even aware of like my own bias in this moment.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
Adam, your defense mechanism is engaged. And she's like, well, are you sure about that? Because she knew enough about my life to this point. She was like, well, tell me about like your academic history. And so for some who've heard, I was in special education when I was really young. I was misdiagnosed. I ended up hating my teachers because of it. And my
Yeah.
whole real academic career, I ended up hating people in positions of authority because I was used to being pigeonholed and not given the opportunity to prove people what my inherent worth really was. And so she pushes me into the spot of I go, okay, well, I don't trust anyone. And she's like, target, like that's the target right there. And I was like, well, why? And she's like, because it's inherently a false narrative. I was like, how do you mean it's a false narrative? Like, no one's ever did. And I started listening. And she said, well, what about me? And it was in that moment where I was like,
Mm-hmm.
fudge, like I do have a target. Where again, you don't realize sort of the operating procedures you elect for yourself to where I was all in on confirming a bias, but not opening myself up to potentials and opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there I think sometimes is a benefit for somebody outside of ourselves who knows us in a way like a mirror
Mm-hmm.
that can provide the platform for an internal reflection we couldn't necessarily reach on our own because of our own biases and blind spots. And it sounds like she was able to provide that for you, that
Yeah.
it's not self-reflection in terms of the the literal definition of going inward and reflecting. It's she held a mirror
Mm,
up to you so you had the ability to reflect on yourself or back into
mm-hmm.
yourself, almost like a prism. Like, let me look back into
Yep.
all the parts that this could have come from. Oh, I think that's obviously being a great professor. And I think a lot of self-sabotage, analytically, sabotage comes from different perspectives. So it can be a form of punishment or self-punishment or like kind of coming out sideways punishment. Basically, we have a drive to punish when somebody does something we don't like. As human beings, our instinct usually is to punish.
Mm-hmm.
And if we do something that we don't like or don't feel worthy of, the punishment goes inward. So it's like that super ego, that internalized version of your parents that supervises and can punish
Yep.
you if you're out of order. So self-sabotage is like a crushing super ego that punishes you for being guilty of doing something internally wrong, which doesn't always correlate to external laws. Like I always tell my students and my clients, when you're guilty, think of it like a courtroom.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're guilty, it's guilty because you broke a law based on societal standards.
Yeah.
Shame is that you violated your own sense of self. And sometimes people define it
Very well
differently.
said.
Like if you feel ashamed that like it's because you violated some other code, and guilt is because it's more, do with it what you will. But when
Yeah.
we're coming at it from analytic theory, there's a guilt because you violated something that you feel like you did wrong. Even if society's like setting a boundary, it's okay. But if internal you and your superego is like, it's wrong to set a boundary, you will punish yourself and maybe undo the
Mhm.
boundary. And then other reasons I would say why people self-sabotage, part of it can be this feeling of power or like omnipotence, like we were talking about with control.
Mm,
They defend against this unconscious fear of becoming all powerful,
yep.
or and this which could or could not remind them of a parent. So some will remain so collapsed or like
Mhm.
impotent in a way, not sexually, because they don't want to damage their loved ones. Because it's like if I fly too high, then I'm gonna be abandoning my
Mhm.
loved ones. So they do it for that reason. I'm trying to think, obviously for self protection.
Well,
Sometimes it
there's
can prevent you. Yeah,
and
go
like
ahead.
in my betrayal work,
Hmm.
sometimes I'll this is gonna like we'll get some comments on this, but so I recognize that when an individual invites a relationship into a committed relationship, I see that as being the offending partner. Absolutely.
Hmm. Hmm.
But where this gets messy is when that partner who is also asking for forgiveness and trying to be the person that he needed or
Yeah.
she needed to be in the
Right.
relationship,
Right.
they're also simultaneously dealing with grief of a loss of a different relationship, right?
Hmm.
And so a lot of people go, well, no, that was a cheating relationship. Well, so this is a challenge when you talk about that impotence, because you were talking about it from an emotional side,
Yeah.
is then there are these self-sabotaging dynamics that happen where the spouse that I said couldn't exist, who is now present, who I'm actually
Hmm.
finding through the courtship and the
Yep.
initiation and the engaging, is also now hostile to this grief process that I'm experiencing when I told myself, oh, only outside of this relationship am I going to find
Yeah.
all these things I want, right? The
Yeah.
most committed person in my corner, that person actually existed. I just never actually asked to cultivate them that way or to, set them up for success for being that person. That's why like I'll call bullshit all day long on a lot of guys that'll be like, well, we had kids and she became so distracted and like, no shit, Sherlock. Like
Were
I'm
you
sorry.
expecting to be her
Like
little boy
like
forever?
yeah, exactly. You're sitting there like, well, wait a second. So you had no problem making the children, but now you're upset that they're here. Like this doesn't make sense
Oh,
to
I have a whole episode in me on that
me.
topic from
Yeah, I
analysis.
watched
Yeah.
like for you who are not watching video, Talia lit up like a Christmas tree. Like
Bing!
she became Chernobyl there for a
Electric.
second.
Yeah.
Like
I'm still radiating.
whoa, like
There's
yeah.
so there because there's so much
Hmm.
to that. Well, I was your special prized
Yeah.
object, and then you discarded me for new life.
And what's interesting is that whole discard. I can understand, like, as a man, I can understand how we can get there in that thought process. I'm not going to
Hmm.
say I'm perfect. I had the same thought process for a minute or two as my child
Yeah.
was born, because there are
Yeah.
things where it's like, basically you guys turn into like self serve machines.
It's
Or,
primary maternal
oh, yeah,
preoccupation. Our job is
absolutely.
to be obsessed with the child, not unhealthily, but like to be all consumed keeping the child alive, because we are still the fourth trimester. We're still one mind. Children don't have that rapprochement or sense of
Yeah,
separate self for quite some time. We need to be obsessed. Like your job is to
yeah,
hold us while we hold the child. And a
exactly.
lot of people do not get that order or hierarchy right. They're like, well, because it didn't happen to you, why do things have to change for me? You right? If I'm the guy,
Yeah.
like, well, you were the pregnant one.
Or this,
What's the problem?
it's funny because the phrasing and the way that we communicate changes as well, where it's like, well, you wanted the child, now you're not here for me, right? And it's like, wait a second, isn't this something that we did? Like we
Also, can you hold your neck up without me?
Yeah,
Can you eat without
exactly.
me? You'll be fine. Like we turn less emotional towards you, because truly how much it takes to be
Hmm.
attuned and bonded to a level that really cultivates lifelong secure attachment. It exists for the first 3 years, and a
Hmm.
lot of couples unfortunately call it quits within the first three years of having kids, or really find that themselves are struggling
Mm,
because they don't understand the psychological underpinnings of why it needs to have the triangles, right? All triangulation, we've done an episode on that, but like
mhm.
the triangles need to shift, where it's like you are an outside third on this triangle. You are still necessary. I'm not saying dads
Yeah.
aren't necessary. Dads have a huge role in both the mother and the
Mhm.
child's mental health. But when it comes to that bonding and attunement, we can't care because it would cost too much.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
self sabotage is rooted in I'm not getting this experience how I wanted.
So I'm going to throw a
I throw,
tantrum.
yeah,
It's imago therapy.
exactly.
Yeah.
Well,
How did
because
you respond to your frustration in childhood? And then you do that as an adult, slam cabinets, storm off, play video games, whatever it is.
and
And
we
then
accept
you're
the
wondering,
present as
yeah.
a
Mm-hmm.
permanence. And that's the problem,
Yes.
is it's a temporary experience that we're
Yes.
navigating here. But because I'm not getting what I want, I'm going to treat the temporary as permanent, and then I'm going to do those
Yeah.
self-sabotage, and I'm going to blow things up again. Why?
Yeah.
Because I know I'm going to ask you to do things you can't do. It's completely unfair to ask a mother, especially in
Mm-hmm.
her first few months, like, hey, you need to be selfish to my needs. You need to caretake
Yeah.
for me. Like, no, when you cry or you
Yeah.
bitch or you walk in through the door, I don't start lactating. Really weird. Like, there's like these
Yeah.
things that, like,
Doesn't do it for me.
moms are
Yeah.
hardwired for
Hardwired.
that
Yeah.
connection with their child. And this is where, again, I come out, I'm really strong as a confrontational therapist of like, no, you are frustrated, you have to play the game differently. Now, I know
Mm-hmm.
that we've all had this experience where you've gone to someone's house and they have told you about new rules that they have elected for Uno or Monopoly or whatever, because we
Mm-hmm.
always have
Mm-hmm.
house rules, right?
Yes.
And so what's interesting is when you pay attention to this dynamic, people will a lot of times be like, well, then I don't want to play, right? That is probably the best metaphor for self
Yep.
sabotage possible,
Yep.
which is I'm not going to be able to do it the way I want to do it. So I'm not going to be open for opportunity or potential of happiness or any of the other
Mm-hmm.
emotions that show up just because I don't get it my way.
Mm-hmm. And so I think a parallel to that is I'm not going to do it the way it's like weaponized incompetence in a way. I'm not going to do it the way I think or I know you want me to do it. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm just not going to try at all,
Yeah.
which leaves the person in who's asking for whatever it might be in the lurch. And I think part of this definitely stems from our own childhood experiences
Mm,
because another type of self-sabotage comes from what we call neurotic loyalty. So let's say your mom or your dad either identified themselves as or experienced some sort of failure in life, they were like an
mm-hmm.
impotent or a weak person, then that the child of those parents might pledge some sort of
Mm,
neurotic allegiance to that failed parent. So they're coming at it from the perspective of like they weren't good enough or they were a failure, so I'm going to sabotage
mm-hmm.
myself to make sure I'll never get ahead of them or
Yeah.
leave, essentially I'll never abandon them. So growth and development are seen as a betrayal. This also happens in very enmeshed families who try to
Mm,
prevent individuation
yeah.
because they don't the enmeshed family system is like, in order for you to stay in here, you have to be like us, the rules thing. And the kid's like, well, I kind of like Johnny's family's house rules. This seems way healthier. And the parent's like, fine, then why don't you go live at Johnny's house? And
Yeah.
it's like, as a parent, you should like be the adult. So when you're faced with this internal problem, when you have this kind of neurotic
Mm-hmm.
loyalty, then that cruel part of your mind, that really critical super ego comes in. And if you believe that developing a separate life leads to betrayal, then you
Mm,
would have to let go of that defeated object that you are identified with, meaning your
yeah.
parent who was impotent for some reason. Then you'd be killing them off, or in some way you're contributing to their destruction.
Mhm.
So it's like the person that drank themselves to death or the
Yeah.
person that was reckless and you feel responsible for that. So it's not just an incident, but it's almost a life of self-sabotage that
Mm,
takes place to prevent that. And then you mix that with like the repetition compulsion or like mastering. It's
mhm.
like a form of self-harm. Basically, I'm going to cheat before you cheat, or I'm going to break up with you, an
Exactly.
anticipatory breakup, I'm going to leave you before you leave me, as a way to recapitulate some of that pain. So analytically speaking, self-sabotage goes very deep in very different directions, and a lot of it does, most of our shit stems from infancy and childhood. But if I felt like I wasn't competent or capable from my childhood, and
Mm,
the only times maybe I got attention is when I did something that was sabotage like, then my brain learns, oh, in order to get attention I have to act bad,
yeah.
or I have to be the one who needs help. You almost put yourself in the position to need to be rescued, and any
Mhm.
success you have, if you feel worthy of it but you know it's going to cost you a relationship, you forego it. And I worked with a couple once years ago, great job opportunity for one of the partners in the relationship,
Mm,
not verbally stated, but subconsciously felt as though the other partner would leave them or feel bested by the job because it did require more time. So they decided to not even tell them they got the
ooh.
job and kept it for a long time till it came out. And the other partner was like, why didn't you take it? So imagine sitting there and being like, you would have let me, right? And because they were, it's the partner. I'm like,
Talk about silent
you never,
resentment, right?
right?
Because that
You
person
never
sat
had
there.
proof. Yes.
sat there hating the crap out of their spouse or
For
significant
months for
other.
something they
Can't believe they
accused
wouldn't have let me had that.
right? And it's like, I would have. Why didn't you just ask? Well, no, because then they draw some correlation. It was just like that other time where I wanted this and you said, and they were like, that was not the same weight as this decision that could have bettered whatever it was, our future, our this, our that. So
Mm,
that was an interesting case to work on because you're sitting there just like, why didn't you tell them? Like, why, if you were going to be told no, why didn't you at least give them and us, all three of
yeah,
us in here, the opportunity to safeguard a little bit if you were told no? It's okay to
yeah.
be told no. How do you handle being told no? And they were so almost allergic, if you will,
Oh,
to
for sure.
hearing that
Because
word
it
that they're
brings
like,
the
I'm not even
ownership
gonna.
in,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
"Oh, shit, I actually had ownership in that? Like, I denied
Mm-hmm.
myself the thing I want." It's almost like getting the Willy Wonka chocolate, like, golden ticket,
Yeah. Yep.
lighting it on fire, and then blaming your spouse. And it's like, "Well,
Right.
why
Yeah.
you would have never let me go." Well, now that the opportunity doesn't exist, now that we couldn't go regardless,
Yeah.
you've
Yeah.
literally written this
Convenient.
story. You've
Yeah.
written my response. That's also something to be paying attention to when we want to move into self sabotage. Are we actually prescribing the role for people around us to play, or are we
Yeah.
actually basing this off of evidence?
Mm-hmm.
Because you can also have people in your life, sorry to tell you about this, but people are dynamic. So they can be massive jackasses in the first few chapters and then they can change. There's like character arcs and stuff. Like it's really crazy. And so,
People can't change, Adam. We wouldn't be therapists if we could believe that. You're silly.
well, so the same mom or dad who didn't let you go to the college of your choice
Yep.
could be the same or different parent now who can help you start your own business. Like, but you won't leave. Oh, they've always said no to things. Well, that past self, and it sounded like they were
Mm-hmm.
broken. It sounded like they didn't have the awareness as they do now.
Mm-hmm.
But who knows? Maybe they could be an ally in this process. No, I'd rather not. Why?
I
Because
want to
if
see them as the bad
I
object.
want to see them as a bad object, but it's a step more. Is I don't want to use the resources around us and then come to find out I'm the reason I can't have nice things. That is
Self
it.
sabotage.
It's
Yeah.
because if I actually came to the other side of saying I had the resources, I had the means, it just wasn't in the cards for me, man, that's a lot more difficult to handle versus being able to
Mm-hmm.
blame mom, dad, spouse, significant other, who's president,
Yeah.
taxes, go down the
Yep.
line,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah. Do a checklist of anybody whose fault it is, except yours. And I'm not saying fault as a fault
No.
blame. It's like it's like I see fault blame on one side of the scale and accountability and ownership on the other side. And so many people are quick to defend
Mm-hmm.
against ever feeling like they're at fault or to blame that they don't know how to move into. I can take accountability and ownership for just my parts of this, and then also maybe cite I made this choice because I was told whatever the taxes were the way that they were. Had they been different, I would have chosen differently.
Mm-hmm.
It's not blaming like, well, if only the taxes weren't that, then I wouldn't have done this. Like, even though the wording of it and the order of operations changes it, like sometimes you are the reason you can't have nice things because you don't have a well integrated enough
Mm-hmm.
psyche to see yourself as both a good and bad object. And that is the work that I do with all of my clients. You
Mm-hmm.
have to be able to see yourself as both without splitting, and you have to be able to see parents or friends or your partner, especially romantically, as both without splitting them off and saying, well, you did
Mm-hmm.
one bad thing, therefore you're all bad. I can never trust you, right? A lot of the absolutes come in always,
Yep.
never. You did that one thing one time 4 years ago. What if you do it again? Who knows?
Yeah.
Okay, what if they don't do it again and you leave them for the fear that they will? The next person you end up with, you react to them and
Mm-hmm.
have so many projective identifications, you essentially make them
Yeah.
do the thing that you were afraid of so you can finally be like, I was right. Is it more important to be right, or is it more important to be in an equitable, mutual,
Yeah.
well-rounded psychological
Do you want to be
relationship?
right or do you want to be happy? And some people take
Yeah.
that sideways. They're like, oh, so you mean co signing faulty beliefs of our spouses? No, no, no. No, I'm just
Mm-mm.
talking about the fact that like you can fight till you're blue in the face on something to be right, but you're not necessarily going to be happy because of it. You're not going to have
Mm-hmm.
joy because of it. You know,
Yeah.
something that you brought up that I think is a great way to like bookend the discussion
Yeah.
is realizing that if you don't accept responsibility in these experiences that you have, then your only strategy moving forward is going to be shame and blame. So like everyone might have
True.
had a knee jerk reaction to when she said fault and like, oh, whoa, whoa. I have to accept to some level there's a responsibility there. And if I don't, then the only strategies are shame and blame. Because when I accept responsibility, I move into healing. I can learn from it. I can actually close this wound. When I refuse to do that, from there on out, it is it's a zero sum game. I
Mm-hmm.
have to push it on someone else. It has to be someone else's problems. Because if I don't, and this all comes around to me living 15 or 20 years of my life in a bullshit strategy that didn't get me anywhere, then man, I'd feel really bad about myself. But I won't as long as it was someone else's responsibility.
Mm-hmm. I will leave listeners with this question they can ponder. Who would you have to become to either obtain
Mm,
or maintain what you think you want in life?
mic drop.
Noodle on that. Free therapy. You're
Yeah,
welcome.
exactly. As always, you can find us on Instagram, on our
Yes.
website, between2clinicians.com. We are around. Ask questions. We're here to answer them.
See you soon. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Between Two Clinicians. We would so appreciate if this episode resonated with you for you to share it with somebody, and also find your favorite podcast platform and like, rate, and subscribe to the podcast. We would love to attract more listeners just like you and have this message be spread to whoever needs it. So thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.